Right, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the landlord of the Lilacs Inn for inviting us along here this evening and for making this meeting possible. Thank you all for coming this evening to learn more about UKIP and its policies and aims for Britain. I'm Dr. Jonathan Munday, UKIP's candidate for Wellingborough in the general election on the 7th of May this year. I've been an NHS GP all my life, working in a practice in London to care for 14,000 NHS patients. I have experience as a local councillor and was mayor of my London borough. I've served as a magistrate and am involved with St John Ambulance and as a trustee of a number of charities. But I stand before you tonight not because of this rather conventional life, but because of a realisation that all the old certainties that I had held to be permanent had broken down. The Conservative Party that I had supported since I joined the Young Conservatives as a teenager has ceased to be the party of Britain and has been hollowed out by 20 years of failure and compromise, so that its leadership now owes more to Blair than to Churchill or Lady Thatcher. Its facade is carefully kept up by a lacquering of money from big business and the banks, but its guts and its brains, its ordinary members and supporters have dribbled away, part to age, part to resignation, part to despair. Cameron and his cabinet of like-minded ministers, some Conservatives, mostly Liberal with a small L, can still mouth the language. If you read only the speeches, you would think they are Conservatives still. But when you read their Acts of Parliament, you know that they are not. There are still a few true believers. Peter Bone, our current member, wanders round his party like an old Anglo-Saxon, wondering as openly as he dares when the continental Normans will go home. But he is impotent and spearless to do anything about it. Obviously one can't vote Labour. What they've done to the fabric of this nation and to our economy will require decades more active forgiveness than I am willing to spare them. The shameless, guilt-free way that successive Labour leaders glide over their record of blunder and plunder to demand another chance to ruin Britain is one of the unexplained marvels of our age. What other party would dare to go into this election led by the two brown hatchet men most closely identified with the bankrupting of Britain only 5 years before? I am here because, like so many former Conservatives, I have got tired of waiting for the Conservative Party to become again the party that it could be and that its supporters would want it to be. During my forlorn wait, another party has appeared that commands my respect and support, and I am here this evening to convince you that UKIP deserves your support too. UKIP is a new party, a genuine grassroots party, held up not by big donations from self-interested, would-be knights and hopeful life peers, but by the collected pennies and pounds of increasing numbers of ordinary Britons who, living closer to the problems caused by the Westminster elite, have realised long before them the declining living standards induced by the unthinking prejudices and politics of successive Labour and Conservative governments. There have been two parties, two governments, but only one elite. We live in an age of government by Tweedledum and Tweedledum. Whom could you vote for if you want sound public finances? Whom could you vote for if you want controlled immigration? Whom if you wanted to stop the encroachment of the EU into public life? Whom if you wanted to rebalance the economy away from the public sector or the banks into well-paid jobs for ordinary people, producing exports and income for the nation's benefit as well as their own? Whom if you wanted to end the waste of life and treasure fighting irrelevant wars in irrelevant countries? That answer is now easy. That answer is UKIP. For UKIP is emphatically more than just the Conservative Party in exile. UKIP is a new alliance. We have learned the lessons of the years of Conservative failure. It is now over 20 years since the Conservatives were able to win a general election. We have learned the lessons of the years of Labour failure. It is now 66 years since Labour passed an Act of Parliament that didn't damage Britain. UKIP is a coalition of former Conservatives fed up with being taxed to the hilt and former Labour voters fed up with being unable to find a job that pays enough to be taxed. And around us, British society breaks down. No other country has had to cope with such an influx of uncontrolled immigration. Our population has risen 10% since the last Conservative government, but we have not built 10% more houses, and house prices have doubled in real terms according to the Nationwide Building Society. We have not trained 10% more doctors, and a GP appointment is like gold dust, not mined in Northamptonshire. We have not built 10% more schools, and getting your child into a good school requires you to move into an ever smaller catchment area at ever higher house prices. Labour and the Conservatives, both members of the Westminster elite, have pushed an economic model known as globalisation that, whilst it yields millions, sometimes billions for the lucky few, has driven down real wages for everyone else. There may be new jobs, but the tax take has failed to rise. The Treasury will receive £32 billion less in income tax this year than it was expecting. And that is because the jobs that have been created are not safe, comfortable, good jobs, but jobs with 0 hours contracts at minimum wage. I worry deeply for our children today. They have to pay £9,000 a year to go to university. When they get out, there aren't any good jobs. And where there are, they are competing against children from the whole of Europe, not just their classmates. Even two-income families struggle to afford a home of their own. We don't make anything in this country anymore, and our balance of trade figures are the worst they have ever been. Some of this money has been ploughed back by oligarchs from Russia, China and Arabia, buying up huge swathes of London, of our industry and of our farmland that are now foreign-owned. Our children risk becoming tenants in their own country. But enough diagnosis. What you need to hear is UKIP's prescription for our nation's ills. First, antibiotics to cure the infection, then vaccination to stop it happening again, and finally physiotherapy to put Britain back on the road to health. The infection that is killing Britain is the deficit in the government finances. Osborne promised it would already be gone if we took his treatment, but 5 years later he has reduced it by barely a third, and Britain plc is spending £91 billion more than it earns each year. In consequence, the national debt has doubled in the last 5 years to £1,400 billion, a debt of £58,000 for every man and woman and child in the country, that our children and our grandchildren will still be paying off at the dawn of the next century. Conservatives and Labour both offer a further programme of cuts in essential public services. Only UKIP dares to be different. We will leave the EU saving the lion's share of our gross annual EU contribution of £25 billion, and will concentrate the overseas aid budget on emergency relief, away from vanity projects like the Indian space programme, saving another £10 billion. That is 1/3 of the remaining annual deficit, and will preserve jobs and services in the police, education and local government that are currently under Labour and Conservative threat. My own contribution is a pledge to take a maximum of half Peter Bone's MP expenses when I am elected. That alone is 2 teachers saved to teach our children. Only UKIP has this antibiotic, and without it, Britain is condemned to years of slow decline in its public services and public life. Second, UKIP offers vaccination against the disease returning. UKIP alone, by leaving the EU, offers the chance to regain our country, no longer exposing us to the damage of foreign control. Most importantly, we will regain control of our borders. UKIP is not against immigrants. As an inner London GP, few politicians have met or listened to the concerns of more immigrants than I. They are exactly the same as yours or mine, concerned for a job, for their health and for their families. Immigration is not about Mrs. Gonzalez or Mr. Iqbal. It is about 6 million new people that Britain just cannot afford to house or heal or school or hand over benefits. UKIP will put a moratorium on immigration whilst we organise a points-based system of immigration similar to those which have operated successfully in Australia and other Commonwealth countries over many years. New immigrants will not be able to access healthcare, public housing or benefits until they have been resident for several years and contributing through taxes on a permanent job. Freed from the straitjacket of the European courts, we will again be able to deport immigrants who have committed crimes in this country. No one else will be forced to leave. UKIP wants to restore Britain as a land strong and prosperous and free. We leave to others the desire for an intrusive, controlling state. Finally, we will provide physiotherapy to strengthen the patient again. We will rebalance the economy away from over-reliance on services and banking by creating jobs again in manufacturing to produce goods for export that will pay for our needs for imported food and energy. We will do this not as Labour would, by bashing the banks and killing Britain's last truly world-beating industry. As a public sector worker, I know who pays my salary, and it is not the government, but the City of London that makes up 16% of the nation's GDP and tax base. All the government does is act as middleman, skimming a bit off the top for itself. UKIP will reduce the jobs tax and reform business rates and corporation tax to encourage the growth and development of small businesses, to return prosperity to regions outside London like Northamptonshire. But UKIP are not just interested in economic reform. We also know the threat to Britain's culture of freedom and individuality and our traditional position of support for the underdog. We will restore the value and the virtue of local effort. We will give voters power to directly elect police and school boards and to demand local referendums on important local issues, including over major planning applications. UKIP are a new party with new policies that has learned from the failure of the Conservative and Labour governments. UKIP politics is not a sterile battle of right versus left, but a common sense battle of right versus wrong. UKIP offers several unique policies designed to treat this nation's ills. At the next general election, Britain has perhaps a last chance to face up to the danger that she is in and the burden she is laying upon her children to carry. Britain has had 20 years of changing governments without changing failing policy. UKIP offers the first new analysis of Britain's plight and the first new policy prescription in all that time. Britain needs UKIP to stand up, as ordinary Britons so often have in our island story, facing defeat with our backs to the wall, coming out fighting. UKIP needs you to fight with her, to regain our country for ourselves and for our children. Vote UKIP in May and make yourselves proud again. Thank you.